I thought moving to the countryside would be simple, a fresh start away from the chaos, away from everything I was running from. But then I met him. A man unlike anyone I'd ever known. He was older, rough around the edges, and spoke only when necessary. But there was something in his eyes, something that made my chest tighten every time he looked at me. And then, one evening out in those endless fields, he showed me something that left me speechless. I didn't know how to react. I didn't know what it meant. But from that moment on, nothing was ever the same. I never thought I'd end up here. A city boy stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields that stretched further than I could see. I never planned on leaving my old life behind. But life had a way of forcing you into places you never imagined yourself. And for me, that place was a farm miles away from anything familiar. I didn't know much about the man who owned it, only his name, Luke Carter. The locals in town whispered about him, how he was always alone, how he didn't say much, how he liked things done his way. A man of few words. A man who didn't need anyone. Or at least that's what they thought. The first time I saw him, I felt something shift inside me. He was standing on the porch, arms crossed over his broad chest, watching as I pulled up in my beat-up car. He had that kind of presence. The kind that made the air feel heavier. Like he didn't need to speak to make you notice him. "You must be Tyler," he said, his voice rough, deep, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had spent years working under the sun. I nodded, gripping the strap of my bag. "Yeah, thanks for letting me stay." He didn't respond right away. Just looked at me for a long second, like he was sizing me up, deciding something, before finally giving a slow nod. "Come on," he said, "I'll show you around." The day passed in a blur of dust, heat, and heavy lifting. Luke moved with ease, his body strong and built from years of work. He didn't waste energy on unnecessary words. But when he did speak, I found myself hanging on to every one. I wasn't used to men like him. Men who carried themselves like they belonged to the land. Men who didn't fill the air with noise just to prove something. And I wasn't sure why. But every time he looked at me, something in my stomach twisted. By nightfall, I was exhausted. The small guest room Luke had given me felt like a safe haven. A quiet place to process everything. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment of the day, every glance, every silence. And then I heard something outside. Without thinking, I got up, stepping onto the porch. The night air was cool against my skin. And in the distance, near the barn, I saw him, Luke, standing there, beer in hand, looking out over the fields like he was searching for something he'd never find. I should have gone back inside. Should have left him alone. But I didn't. I walked toward him, my heartbeat loud in my chest. He didn't turn as I approached. But I knew he knew I was there. "You don't sleep much, do you?" he said. I hesitated, then shook my head. "Not lately." He took a slow sip of his beer. The silence stretching between us, thick with something I couldn't name. And then he finally turned. And for the first time, he really looked at me, a slow, unreadable glance, his dark eyes holding something that made my breath hitch. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew one thing. I wasn't ready for what would happen next. The way Luke looked at me sent a chill down my spine. Not because it was cold, not because I was scared, but because it felt like he saw straight through me, like he already knew things I hadn't even figured out for myself. I wanted to say something, break the silence, but my throat was dry. Luke took another sip of his beer, eyes never leaving mine. Then finally he turned back to the open fields, his voice low, almost like an afterthought. City life wasn't for you. I swallowed hard. Not anymore. He nodded once, like he understood more than I was telling him. The truth was I had nowhere else to go. The city had chewed me up and spat me out. A failed relationship. A career that never took off. Debts stacking up until I couldn't breathe anymore. I had come here looking for an escape, a way to hit reset. But standing there in the quiet of his land, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the distant call of an owl, I wondered if maybe this place was going to change me in ways I wasn't ready for. Luke finished his beer, setting the empty bottle on the wooden fence post. "Sunrises at 5, he said. "I'll need you up by then." I blinked. 5? He smirked. "Just slightly. That a problem?" I straightened my shoulders. "No, I'll be up." He nodded. "Good." And just like that, he walked away. I stayed outside a little longer, watching his silhouette disappear into the barn, my chest tight with something I couldn't name. I barely got 4 hours of sleep before my alarm dragged me out of bed. The second I stepped outside, the cold morning air hit me like a slap. Luke was already waiting by the barn, arms crossed, looking like he had been awake for hours. "You're late," he said. I frowned, checking my phone. It's 4:58. His smirk was barely there, but I caught it. Like I said, late. He handed me a pair of worn work gloves. "Today, you're with me." I pulled the gloves on, ignoring the way my pulse kicked up at those words. We spent the next few hours in silence, working side by side. I shoveled hay, fixed fences, learned how to feed the cattle. It was hard, exhausting, and yet it felt good. And Luke, he barely spoke. But when he did, it was short, direct, and impossible to ignore. "Don't rush. Do it right the first time. Use your legs, not your back, unless you want to be sore all week. You're not as useless as you look." I scoffed at that one, throwing him a glare, but he just smirked and kept working. By midday, my muscles burned. My shirt was drenched in sweat, and I had never felt more alive. We sat on the porch drinking water, catching our breath. Luke glanced at me. "You're doing better than I expected." I raised a brow. "What did you expect?" He took a long sip of water, watching me over the rim of his glass before answering. "Someone who wouldn't last a day." I exhaled a laugh. "Thanks for the confidence." He set his glass down, leaning back against the porch railing. "You want people to take you seriously? Earn it." Something about the way he said it hit me deeper than it should have. I wasn't sure if he was talking about the work or something else entirely. Before I could say anything, he stood up, stretching his muscles, pulling under his sweat-stained shirt. "Go eat something," he said. "We're not done for the day." I watched him walk off, his presence lingering even after he was gone. And for the first time since arriving here, I wasn't sure if I had come to this place to escape something or if I had just walked straight into something I wasn't ready for. By the time the sun started to set, I felt like my body had been put through a shredder. Every muscle burned, my hands were raw despite the gloves, and I was sure I'd never get the smell of hay and sweat off my skin. And yet, I didn't hate it. I had spent the entire day working side by side with Luke. No distractions, no noise, just the rhythm of physical labor, the occasional gruff command from him, and the way I was starting to learn how he moved, how he worked, how he thought. I hadn't realized how much I had been watching him until I caught myself doing it again. He was standing near the barn, one hand gripping a wooden post, his body covered in a sheen of sweat from the heat. His shirt clung to him, outlining broad shoulders and a firm chest. His jaw was tight, lips slightly parted as he exhaled slowly. Catching his breath, I swallowed hard. It was ridiculous. I wasn't supposed to be thinking like this. But then, as if he could feel my stare, he turned. Our eyes locked. I should have looked away. I should have done something to make it seem like I hadn't just been caught looking at him in a way I definitely shouldn't have. But I didn't move, and neither did he. For a moment, we just stood there staring, the space between us somehow feeling smaller than before. Then he nodded toward the house. "Go wash up." His voice was rough, steady, like nothing had just happened, like I hadn't just been completely unprepared for whatever was happening inside me. I nodded quickly, turning away too fast, practically running toward the house. I needed to clear my head. The cold water in the shower did nothing to help. No matter how hard I tried to shake it, Luke was still there in my head. The way he moved, the way he looked at me, the way he didn't look away. I gritted my teeth, running my hands through my wet hair, trying to convince myself that it meant nothing. I was just tired. That was all. Nothing else. But the way my pulse jumped at the sound of boots outside the bathroom door told me I was lying to myself. By the time I stepped out onto the porch, Luke was already sitting there, a bottle of beer in his hand, staring out into the darkening sky. He didn't look up when I sat down next to him, but he didn't tell me to leave either. The air was cooler now, the scent of fresh grass mixed with the faint smoke from the fire pit near the barn. I exhaled slowly. "Do you ever take a break?" He smirked slightly, taking a slow sip of beer. "This is my break." I shook my head, leaning back against the railing, watching the stars. "I don't get you. That's probably for the best." I turned my head, studying his profile, the way his jaw clenched slightly, the way his fingers curled around the bottle in his hand. There was something there, something unspoken, and before I could think about it, the words slipped out. "Are you always this hard to figure out?" He finally looked at me. Then a slow, deliberate glance, like he was considering whether or not to answer. Then he set his beer down, resting his elbows on his knees, looking straight ahead again. I don't waste words. I let out a short laugh. Yeah, I've noticed. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly, but he didn't say anything else. I watched him, waiting for something, anything, and just when I was about to give up, he spoke. "You think too much," he muttered. I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You overanalyze everything. Sometimes things just are." I stared at him, my chest tightening, because something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just talking about me but about us, about this, made my stomach flip. I wet my lips, suddenly unsure of what to say. And then he stood up. "You should get some sleep." I blinked. "That's it?" He smirked, grabbing his beer again. "That's it." I wanted to be frustrated, but I wasn't, because I could feel it, the shift, the weight of something unspoken between us, something neither of us was ready to name. And for now, that was enough. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, the way he moved, the way he looked at me, the way he didn't look away. I told myself it was nothing. Just exhaustion. Just my mind playing tricks on me after too many hours under the sun. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't nothing. It was him. And no matter how much I tried to push it away, it wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Luke was already outside by the time I stepped onto the porch. He was working near the fence, shirt already damp with sweat, sleeves rolled up over his forearms. He hadn't seen me yet, and for a moment, I just watched him. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Some kind of confirmation that I wasn't crazy. That this thing between us, whatever it was, wasn't just in my head. Then, as if sensing me, he turned. Our eyes met. My breath caught. I expected him to look away, to brush past me like usual, pretend like nothing had changed. But he didn't. He held my gaze steady, unreadable, his expression giving nothing away. And then he smirked, not a full smile, just the barest twitch of his lips, like he knew exactly what was going through my head. And just like that, my stomach flipped. I turned quickly, walking toward the barn before I could make a bigger fool of myself. The day passed in a blur of hard labor and thick silence. Luke barely spoke, but he didn't have to. The weight of something unspoken between us was louder than any words. Every glance, every brief moment of eye contact, it was like a silent dare. A question neither of us wanted to ask, or maybe a question we were both too scared to answer. By sunset, I was exhausted again, but my body wasn't the problem. My mind was. I was getting too comfortable here, too comfortable with him, and that was dangerous, because if I let myself go too far, if I let myself fall into this, there would be no way out. That night, I stepped outside again, needing air. Luke was there, like always. He was standing near the fence, a cigarette between his fingers, watching the horizon. Music, I hesitated for half a second before walking toward him. He didn't turn as I approached, but I knew he knew I was there. "You don't seem like the type to smoke," I said. He exhaled slowly, the smoke curling in the cool night air. "I don't." I raised a brow. "Then why it?" He finally looked at me, his eyes darker than usual. "You ask too many questions." I huffed out a quiet laugh. "Maybe you don't give enough answers." Silence. Then, before I could process it, he handed me the cigarette. I stared at it, unsure what he was trying to prove. A test, a challenge, or something else entirely. I took it from his fingers, bringing it to my lips, inhaling slowly. The burn was sharp, but I didn't let it show. Luke watched me carefully. Then his eyes dropped, not to my hands, not to the cigarette, to my mouth. I felt my pulse slam against my ribs. I shouldn't have noticed, but I did, and judging by the way his jaw tightened, so did he. I exhaled, handing the cigarette back. Our fingers brushed for just a second, just long enough for something to shift, something irreversible. He held my gaze, the cigarette still between his fingers, his expression unreadable. I swallowed hard. "Go to bed, kid," he murmured. I should have left, but I didn't. I stood there, waiting for something to happen, for him to move, for me to move, but neither of us did. The night stretched between us, thick, unspoken, impossible to ignore, and I knew deep in my chest this wasn't nothing. This was dangerous, and worse than that, I wanted it anyway. I should have walked away. I should have turned around, gone back inside, and pretended that nothing had happened. But I didn't. I stood there, my pulse hammering, my body refusing to move. Luke was still watching me, cigarette between his fingers, smoke curling in the night air. His eyes were unreadable, but something about the way he held himself felt different, less guarded, more dangerous. The silence stretched between us, thick, unspoken, charged with something I wasn't sure I was ready to name. Then he took a step forward. It was small, barely anything at all, but it was enough. Enough to make my breath hitch. Enough to make my body lock in place. Enough to make me realize he wasn't stopping this. And neither was I. I swallowed hard. Luke. His name felt foreign on my tongue. Like saying it out loud would make this real. He exhaled slowly, flicking the cigarette away, his voice low. "Tell me to stop." I didn't. I couldn't. Because the truth was I didn't want him to. His jaw tensed, like he was fighting something inside himself. But his body didn't move away. "You don't know what you're doing," he muttered. I forced out of breath. "Neither do you." His eyes flickered, just for a second, like I had hit something deeper than I meant to. Then he moved, not rushed, not hesitant, deliberate. I barely had time to process it before his fingers brushed against my jaw. A touch so light it almost wasn't there, but it set my entire body on fire. My breath caught. I should have pulled away. I should have done something to stop this before it went too far. But instead, I leaned into him. That was all it took. A flicker of something dark crossed his expression. Something hungry, something possessive. Then his hand tightened, and before I could stop myself, I kissed him. It wasn't careful. It wasn't soft. It was reckless, desperate, like something we had both been trying to ignore for too long. Luke didn't pull away. He kissed me back, his grip on me firm, like he was finally claiming something he had been denying himself. My hands curled into his shirt, pulling him closer, feeling the heat of him, the tension, the raw, unspoken want that had been building between us since the moment I stepped onto his land. And for the first time, I stopped thinking. For the first time, I let myself fall, because this wasn't just about want. This was about need, and I needed him. I should have felt regret. I should have pulled away the second it happened. Told myself this was a mistake, that I had just ruined everything. But I didn't, because when Luke kissed me back, really kissed me, with all the restraint he had been holding on to for weeks finally snapping, I knew there was no coming back from this. This wasn't just a mistake. This was inevitable. His fingers gripped my jaw firm, but not forceful, his body pressing against mine in a way that sent a sharp thrill down my spine. My hands curled into his shirt, holding on to him like I was afraid he'd disappear the second I let go. His lips were rough, hungry, but his movements were controlled. Too controlled, like he was fighting something even as he gave into it. And then he pulled away. The loss of his warmth hit me like a slap, my chest tightening as his forehead rested against mine. His breath was heavy, uneven. His fingers still lingered on my skin. But when he spoke, his voice was different, unsteady. "This can't happen." My stomach dropped. I swallowed hard, my pulse still hammering. It already did. His jaw tensed. I could see it, the battle waging inside him. The part of him that wanted me and the part of him that was still trying to fight it. He exhaled sharply, stepping back, creating space between us. "I can't give you what you want," he muttered. I felt my chest tighten. "How do you know what I want?" Silence. Then finally he looked at me. "You should go inside," he said quietly. I clenched my fists. "That's it? You're just going to pretend like nothing happened?" His expression was unreadable. It shouldn't have happened. The words hit me harder than I expected. I shook my head, forcing out a bitter laugh. "Right. Of course." I turned, moving toward the house, my heart pounding. But before I could reach the door, his voice stopped me. "Tyler." I paused, but I didn't turn around. He didn't say anything else. And that was the worst part, because it meant he was letting me go. Music, and for the first time since I got here, I wasn't sure I could walk away. Some things are too powerful to ignore. But what happens when the person you want is too scared to want you back? What would you do in Tyler's place? Would you fight for it or walk away? Let's talk in the comments. If this story kept you hooked, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications for more stories that will leave you breathless. But